Good morning. I'm going to continue today talking about the Buddha section, which I talked about a couple of days ago, from the Dhammapada, because there are still some good verses in this section. I'm going to read a few of them towards the end of that section. So from verse 188. Driven by fear, men go to many a refuge, to mountains and forests, to graves and shrines. But these are not safe refuges, for a man is not delivered from suffering in them. He who takes refuge in the Buddha, the law and the order, who clearly sees the Four Noble Truths, suffering, the cause of suffering, the ceasing of suffering, and the Noble Eightfold Path that leads to the end of suffering, will find refuge here and be delivered from all suffering. So it begins in that way where we can't find refuge. So don't forget that he was often talking to monks and people living a full-time Buddhist life, and they would indeed have gone to mountains and to forests and so on as a way to intensify their practice. But as we know, it's all very well to go through the motions and thinking that will be our spiritual life. It can even happen in meditation, can't it? We can spend weeks or months kind of going through the motions and not really applying ourselves or not really being aware of whether we're really meditating. We might just see it, for example, as a bit of time out, a bit of me time to sit there and have a bit of space, for example. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I think it's really important that we recognise when we are actually meditating, when we've got a sort of resolve. That's why it's a good idea to really check at the beginning of our meditation about our intention. Noticing whether we're enthusiastic or not for what we're doing, the fact that we're sitting there. And, if we intend to follow the breath, are we really resolved to follow the breath? Anyway, I think there's a book called Wherever We Go, There We Are, which is probably Pema Chodron, I imagine. Wherever we go, there we are. And I think this verse really encapsulates that. We can't escape from ourselves, and often we think we can. We use all sorts of diversions to avoid really being aware, but wherever we go, there we are. So mountains and forests and so on, they are not safe refuges because we are not delivered from suffering in them. So then it goes on to tell us exactly what does lead to the end of suffering. And of course, first of all, it's taking refuge. It's a funny old word, isn't it, refuge, when you think about it. So he who takes refuge in the Buddha, the law and the order, who clearly sees the Four Noble Truths. So the Buddha, the law, of course, is the Dharma, and the order is the Sangha. But we don't take refuge in, the Sangha that we refer to, the Norwich Buddhist Centre Sangha, because, as we know, people are not safe refuges unless they have gained enlightenment or unless they are very much wiser and insightful than we are. So we take refuge in what's called the Arya Sangha or the Noble Sangha, and that is those who have gained enlightenment, and the Dharma, and the Buddha, of course, the Buddha himself. And we can be inspired by stories of the Buddha, stories of his life, and stories that we find, in the Pali Canon, which has got some really marvellous stories expressing how he teaches in all these different ways. Sometimes he teaches with words, sometimes with actions. There are many different ways that the Buddha taught, depending on who he was teaching. He was always very appropriate. So his first teaching were these four noble truths, and goes on to tell us what they are, which is suffering, the cause of suffering, the ceasing of suffering, and the Noble Eightfold Path that leads to the ceasing of suffering. So just a reminder, that just because suffering is at the heart of Buddhist teaching doesn't mean he just thought there was no fun or enjoyment in life, there was no happiness in life to be had. But really there is more and more happiness through awareness. And one of the things that we have to be aware of is the unsatisfactoriness of all conditioned phenomena. Ultimate satisfaction. Not that there's no satisfaction, but of course there's the reason that we experience dukkha is because of old age, sickness and death. Those sights that the Buddha saw, which prompted him to leave home, knowing that he could never discover within his present very privileged life, he could never discover what could possibly lead to the end of suffering. And that sadhu that he saw as the fourth sight, carrying his bowl and with a shaven head and his robes, what he saw was somebody really peaceful, somebody outside of the usual conventions that people find happiness in. And he looked radiant and calm and aware. So, we can't escape suffering by clinging. The cause of suffering, craving, clinging. And just a reminder of those lists that the Buddha talked about that create suffering. The fact of old age, sickness and death, and being parted from things that we love, having to tolerate difficult circumstances. None of that can we escape. And we spend a lot of energy trying to escape them. So the Noble Eightfold Path, that is the path that leads to the ceasing of suffering. And it's interesting because I remember when I first came across the Noble Eightfold Path, I thought, gosh, it sounds very mundane, doesn't it? Right speech and right livelihood and right effort. It sounds all very down to earth. But what I realised by practicing the Eightfold Path is that, each of those strands or limbs or whatever you want to call them of the Noble Eightfold Path, there's no limit to the depth at which you can practice at each one of them. There is no limit. And so we practice initially at quite a superficial stage, but then we have to go deeper all the time. And why I say we have to is because if we meditate daily, then awareness grows. Our awareness grows, our mindfulness grows. And through that mindfulness, we come to practice the precepts more and more deeply. And we realise that there's no limit to them. We realise initially, certainly, I certainly saw this, the shallowness of the way that my behaviour was ethical. It was pretty shallow, I didn't really think about the deeper implications. So, yes, probably, that's one of the reasons that Sangharakshita, instead of calling these limbs of the Noble Eightfold Path, right view, right intention, right speech, he used the word perfect instead of right. And I think by doing that, he was pointing us to the highest level of practice, to what's possible. So we will find refuge there and be delivered from all suffering. So that's the I was going to say that's the promise, but the promise makes it sound like it's from somebody else. I mean, basically, we have to try all this for ourselves, don't we? We have to try it for ourselves, but it's no good dabbling. It's no good half practicing, practicing with half our effort, half our intention, and having our finger in all sorts of other pies. There's so much on offer out there, but unless we give this our full attention, unless we really practice wholeheartedly, then we won't be able to discover the full benefits of what the Buddha taught. So, on that note, I'm going to go and meditate now. So I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.